The guns fell silent in May 1945, but Europe did not breathe easier. It stood stunned, cities in ashes, borders erased, millions of people wandering without names, homes, or graves to mourn at. For the victors, the war had ended. For the survivors of the Holocaust, it had merely changed its shape. They walked out of camps into a world that had learned how to move on, frighteningly fast. Former Nazis returned to civilian life. SS men shaved their beards, changed their names, found jobs. Neighbors who had watched deportations now spoke of hard times and not knowing. Courts promised justice. Trials promised truth. But for many who had lost everything, promises sounded hollow. 6 million Jews were dead, and most of their killers were alive. In the displaced persons camps scattered across Germany and Austria, a dangerous idea began to circulate. Quietly at first, then with growing certainty. If the world could not deliver justice, justice would have to be taken, not through courts, not through verdicts, but through revenge. They called themselves Nakam, revenge. They were not criminals by profession. They were poets, partisans, students, teenagers who had survived ghettos and forests, camps and firing squads. People who had learned one brutal lesson: that morality collapses when law collapses with it. At their center stood a man who believed words were no longer enough. Abba Kovner, once a poet, once a resistance fighter, now something else entirely. Kovner had seen Vilna burn. He had seen families erased in hours. And when he looked at post-war Europe, he did not see repentance. He saw forgetfulness. He saw convenience. He saw history preparing to close the book before the last page had been written. So Nakam imagined an answer the world was not ready to hear. Not punishment of individuals, but a reckoning for a nation. Their slogan was as chilling as it was simple: 6 million for 6 million. What they planned next would have crossed a line even the victors of the war feared to approach. It would have turned survivors into executioners, and history into a moral minefield with no safe path through it. This is the story of who they were, what they planned, and why, in the end, their revenge was stopped. Not because the pain had faded, but because the consequences might have reshaped the world forever. Who were Nakam? They did not emerge from victory. They emerged from survival. When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, the people who would soon call themselves Nakam were not celebrating liberation in the streets. They were standing in camps for displaced persons, sleeping in former barracks and abandoned factories, surrounded by barbed wire that had not yet been taken down. Some were still wearing the same clothes they had worn at liberation. Others had nothing but what the Allies had issued them. Almost all of them were alone. Their families were gone, their communities erased, their pre-war lives reduced to memory and ash. They were young, for the most part, teenagers who had learned to shoot before they learned a trade, men and women in their 20s who had already lived several lives: student, ghetto inmate, fugitive, partisan, survivor. People who had seen death not as an abstract idea, but as a daily procedure carried out with paperwork, lists, and schedules. To the outside world, they were refugees. To themselves, they were witnesses. And witnesses, they believed, had responsibilities. Nakam did not form as an organization in the conventional sense. There were no charters, no official hierarchy, no uniforms. It grew organically out of overlapping networks of Jewish resistance that had existed during the war: partisan units in Eastern Europe, underground cells in ghettos, smugglers, couriers, and fighters who had learned how to move invisibly through hostile territory. What bound them together was not ideology in the political sense, but a shared conclusion about the post-war world: that justice, as it was being offered, was a performance. They watched the early announcements of trials with cautious interest. They listened to speeches about accountability and the rule of law. But they also watched former Nazis return to their homes, reclaim property, and resume ordinary lives with astonishing speed. The same police stations that had enforced anti-Jewish laws were now enforcing Allied regulations. The same bureaucrats who had organized deportations were suddenly indispensable administrators. The survivors noticed something the rest of Europe preferred not to articulate. The system that had enabled genocide was still largely intact. Many members of Nakam had already fought once against impossible odds. They had seen uprisings crushed, resistance cells betrayed, entire forests burned in retaliation. They knew what defeat looked like. What they were seeing now did not look like justice delayed. It looked like justice abandoned. The core of the group came from three overlapping worlds. First were the former partisans, Jews who had escaped ghettos and camps to fight in forests across Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, and Ukraine. They had lived off stolen food, slept underground, and relied on local contacts who could turn hostile overnight. They had sabotaged rail lines, attacked German patrols, and executed collaborators. Violence was not theoretical to them. It was a skill acquired under pressure. Second were survivors of extermination and concentration camps. Some had been liberated from places whose names would soon become synonymous with industrial murder. Others had survived forced labor camps, death marches, or hiding. They carried physical scars, chronic illness, and memories that refused to fade. For them, the idea that their tormentors might never face consequences was not just unjust, it was obscene. Third were members of the Jewish underground who had operated inside ghettos and occupied cities. Forgers, couriers, intelligence gatherers, and organizers. They knew how systems worked from the inside. They knew how easily rules could be bent, papers altered, identities erased. They understood bureaucracy, and therefore how easily it could be weaponized in either direction. Together, these people formed the nucleus of Nakam. They did not see themselves as soldiers. Soldiers fought wars between states. Nakam believed the war they had lived through had never been declared properly, and therefore could never truly end. They were not avenging a lost battle. They were responding to an annihilation. Their leader, by circumstance as much as intention, was Abba Kovner. Before the war, Kovner had been a poet in Vilna, a city renowned for its intellectual and cultural life. He believed deeply in language, in art, in the idea that culture itself could be a form of resistance. That belief shattered in 1941, when the German occupation turned Vilna into a killing ground. Kovner was among the first to understand what the Nazis intended. When others clung to hope that deportations meant labor, he recognized the pattern of mass murder unfolding in nearby forests. In the Vilna ghetto, he helped write and distribute a manifesto that would later become legendary for its clarity and desperation. A call for Jews to resist, rather than submit to annihilation. During the war, Kovner became a partisan leader, coordinating sabotage and armed resistance. He saw fighters die not as martyrs, but as young people robbed of futures. He learned that moral clarity did not protect anyone, only action did. When liberation came, Kovner was not relieved. He was enraged. He traveled through post-war Europe and saw a continent eager to close the chapter. Reconstruction plans moved forward. Political alliances shifted. The emerging Cold War quickly reframed priorities. Former Nazis were no longer the primary enemy. Stability was. To Kovner, this felt like betrayal layered on top of catastrophe. He and those around him began to articulate what many survivors felt, but few dared to say openly. That the world had failed not once, but twice. First, by allowing genocide to happen. Then, by allowing its architects to escape meaningful punishment. From this realization came the name they chose for themselves, Nakam, revenge. The word was deliberately blunt. It was not cloaked in euphemism. They did not speak of reconciliation or healing. They spoke of accounting. But revenge, as they understood it, was not personal vendetta. It was not about tracking down a single guard or officer who had committed specific acts of cruelty. That kind of justice, they believed, had already been made impossible by scale. The Holocaust had been bureaucratic, systematic, and collective. It had required not just killers, but clerks, drivers, neighbors, and institutions. Nakam concluded that responding to such a crime with individualized trials alone was a category error. Their thinking was stark. If guilt had been distributed across a society, then responsibility could not be isolated to a handful of defendants. This belief placed them on a collision course with emerging post-war norms. The Nuremberg trials, which began later in 1945, were hailed internationally as a triumph of law. Nakam saw them differently. To them, Nuremberg was slow, selective, and political. It punished a symbolic elite while leaving the machinery of everyday complicity untouched. They did not deny the importance of law. They denied its sufficiency. Inside Nakam, discussions were intense, often brutal. There were arguments about limits, about innocence, about whether children or civilians could ever be legitimate targets. These debates did not lead to consensus, so much as exhaustion. Many members felt that asking such questions after the Holocaust was itself a form of moral indulgence. Had anyone asked whether Jewish children were legitimate targets when ghettos were liquidated? Had anyone paused for ethical reflection as families were marched to pits? In this moral landscape, restraint felt arbitrary. What distinguished Nakam from spontaneous acts of post-war revenge, beatings, lynchings, summary executions that occurred across Europe, was intent. Nakam did not want catharsis. They wanted equivalence, a response that would force the world to confront the magnitude of what had been done, not through testimony, but through consequence. They believed that memory alone was too fragile, that documentation could be ignored, that trials could be dismissed as victor's justice. Fear, however, was universal. This conviction hardened quickly. By the end of 1945, Nakam was no longer a loose collection of angry survivors. It was a network preparing to act. Information was gathered, contacts were established. Ideas that would soon be known as Plan A were already circulating in whispered conversations and coded letters. For now, however, they were still defining themselves, not as victims, not as soldiers, but as survivors who refused to accept that history could simply move on. And in that refusal, they stepped onto a path from which there would be no easy return. For the people who would become Nakam, the end of the war did not feel like an ending. It felt like a transition into something colder, quieter, and in some ways, more disturbing. Violence had receded from the streets, but it had not been replaced by truth. Instead, it was replaced by procedure, forms, hearings, statements, committees. Justice, they were told, would come through courts. But courts move slowly, and memory does not. In displaced persons camps, survivors followed news of the trials with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Radios crackled with reports from Nuremberg. Names were read aloud: Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel. The world watched senior Nazi leaders defend themselves in tailored suits, speaking calmly about duty, orders, and misunderstanding. Lawyers argued, judges listened. Translators worked tirelessly to convert horror into legal language. To Nakam, the spectacle felt surreal. They did not deny the importance of law. They denied its adequacy. What they had lived through could not be reduced to indictments against a few dozen men. The Holocaust, in their eyes, was not the product of a rogue leadership hijacking an otherwise innocent society. It was a system that had required participation at every level. Railway workers had driven the trains. Clerks had processed the lists. Neighbors had looted apartments still warm from deportation. Local police had rounded people up. And now, most of those people were still alive. This realization shaped Nakam's ideology more than any manifesto ever could. Their worldview was not built in theory, but in observation. They saw how quickly Germans spoke of suffering, their own suffering, while rarely speaking of responsibility. Bombed cities became symbols of victimhood. Expelled ethnic Germans were mourned. Hunger and cold were framed as shared tragedy. The Jews, once again, were expected to understand. For Nakam, this expectation was unbearable. They concluded that the world was preparing to forgive before it had truly understood what had happened. Worse, it was preparing to forget. The Holocaust risked becoming a crime without criminals, a tragedy without perpetrators. This is where their most infamous slogan took shape: 6 million for 6 million. The phrase was not shouted in rallies or printed on banners. It circulated quietly, spoken in low voices, written in coded notes. It was arithmetic, not rhetoric. A statement of equivalence meant to shock even those who uttered it. To outsiders, it sounded monstrous. To Nakam, it sounded honest. They believed that the scale of the crime demanded a response of equal magnitude. Anything less would confirm that Jewish lives were still valued differently, that mass murder could be absorbed by history with minimal consequence. This belief placed Nakam at odds, not only with the Allied authorities, but also with many Jewish leaders and institutions. There were survivors who rejected revenge entirely, who believed that rebuilding life was the only meaningful answer to genocide. There were others who supported individual accountability, but recoiled at the idea of collective punishment. Nakam understood these objections. They simply did not accept them. Their reasoning was ruthless. If collective punishment was immoral, then the Holocaust itself had already destroyed morality. If killing innocents was wrong, then innocence had lost its protective power the moment children were murdered systematically. They did not argue that revenge was good. They argued that it was inevitable. In their view, the post-war emphasis on legality was itself a luxury afforded to those who had not been targeted for extinction. Law presupposed a functioning moral order. They had lived through its collapse. This did not mean Nakam was driven by uncontrollable rage. On the contrary, their discussions were often painfully precise. They debated numbers, targets, consequences. They asked not whether revenge was justified, but how it could be made meaningful. They rejected random violence, pogroms, lynchings, impulsive killings. These happened in the chaotic months after liberation, but Nakam distanced itself from them. Such acts, they believed, satisfied anger, but changed nothing. They wanted something that would force the world to stop and reckon. Fear, they concluded, was the only universal language left. This conviction did not arise in a vacuum. It was shaped by experience. Many Nakam members had participated in wartime resistance, where violence was not symbolic but instrumental. They had seen how quickly authority dissolved under pressure. They had seen how rules bent when force was applied decisively. They had also seen how moral arguments failed to move anyone when survival was at stake. To them, the Holocaust was proof that appeals to humanity did not work. Appeals to law had arrived too late. If anything was to prevent future annihilation, it would have to be something that could not be ignored. The idea of collective responsibility became central to their thinking. Nakam argued that German society had not merely tolerated genocide, but benefited from it. Jewish property had been redistributed. Jobs had opened. Apartments had been reassigned. Silence had been rewarded. This was not an accusation against every individual German, but against the structure of society itself. Nakam did not claim that every German was a murderer. They claimed that the system had made murder possible and profitable on a national scale. In this framework, punishing only the leadership was insufficient. It allowed the majority to retreat into narratives of ignorance and coercion. It transformed genocide into an aberration rather than a social process. Nakam refused that interpretation. They believed that if German civilians experienced fear on a mass scale, even briefly, It would shatter the illusion of distance between action and consequence. It would make denial impossible. It would carve memory into flesh, not archives. This belief terrified even some within the group. There were members who worried about the moral cost, who asked whether becoming executioners would destroy whatever remained of their humanity, who feared that revenge would contaminate the very memory of Jewish suffering. These doubts did not go unanswered. They were met with a counter-question that silenced many debates. What humanity had been shown to them? For Nakam, the danger was not becoming monsters. The danger was disappearing quietly into history while their killers lived full lives. The danger was that the Holocaust would become a lesson discussed in classrooms, rather than a wound that demanded consequence. Their ideology was shaped as much by despair as by anger. Despair that the world could absorb such crimes and still function. Despair that empathy had limits. Despair that memory alone was fragile. They did not believe revenge would heal them. They believed it would mark history. This is why their thinking gravitated toward actions of symbolic magnitude. Small acts would be forgotten. Large ones would not. The world, they believed, needed to be shocked into remembrance. By the end of 1945, these ideas had solidified. Nakam was no longer asking whether to act, but how. The slogan had done its work. It had stripped away ambiguity. It had reduced unimaginable suffering to a grim equation that demanded resolution. In choosing that equation, Nakam crossed a moral boundary that even many survivors refused to approach. They accepted that their actions might be condemned. They accepted that history might judge them harshly. What they would not accept was irrelevance. The ideology of Nakam was not built on hope. It was built on the conviction that without consequence, atrocity repeats. That a world allowed to move on too easily is a world that has learned nothing. From this conviction emerged their most dangerous idea yet, a plan not aimed at individuals, but at a nation. And once that idea took hold, there was no turning back. Plan A. By the end of 1945, the ideas circulating inside Nakam stopped being theoretical. The slogan had done its work. The ideology had hardened. What remained was execution. The members of Nakam understood that if they acted, they could act only once. There would be no second chance, no escalation, no learning from mistakes. Whatever they did would define them forever, as survivors who broke the silence, or as criminals history would rather forget. That understanding shaped the scale of what they planned. They did not want to kill a handful of men in dark alleys. They did not want secret graves or unmarked deaths. They wanted an event so vast that it could not be absorbed quietly. Something that would rupture the illusion that the war had ended neatly, that responsibility could be confined to courtrooms. Their solution was terrifyingly modern: water. Post-war Germany was broken, but its cities were still alive. Millions of civilians depended on centralized water systems that had survived bombing or had been hastily repaired. These systems were vulnerable, understaffed, and poorly guarded. Engineers were scarce. Oversight was minimal. In many places, Allied authorities relied on former German personnel simply because no one else knew how the infrastructure worked. To Nakam, this vulnerability looked like destiny. Water did not distinguish between guilty and innocent. It did not require direct confrontation. It flowed everywhere, silently, invisibly. Introduced at the right point, poison would spread through entire neighborhoods before anyone understood what was happening. The plan envisioned multiple cities, large urban centers where population density would amplify the effect. The goal was not precision, it was scale. Nakam believed that only mass impact could mirror the mass crime they were answering. They spoke openly among themselves about numbers that would later haunt historians. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps more. Not because they relished the figure, but because anything less felt like symbolic protest rather than reckoning. In their minds, this was not murder in the traditional sense. It was consequence. They convinced themselves that German civilians had lived surrounded by consequence-free benefit during the war. Now, consequence would arrive without warning, just as deportations had arrived without warning for Jews. The moral inversion was deliberate. Planning such an operation required something Nakam did not yet have: access to poison and expertise. This was not a matter of improvised toxins or crude sabotage. The substance had to be potent, fast-acting, and difficult to detect before it was too late. This necessity narrowed responsibility to a single individual: Abba Kovner. Kovner was not chosen because he was reckless. He was chosen because he commanded trust. He had survived leadership under conditions where betrayal meant death. He was articulate, disciplined, and able to move between worlds, between the raw fury of survivors and the cautious pragmatism of emerging Jewish institutions. If anyone could secure what Nakam needed, it was him. He traveled under false papers, carrying little with him, moving through a Europe still saturated with spies, informants, and military patrols. His destination lay beyond the continent, toward networks that had resources, contacts, and scientific knowledge. But the world Kovner entered was no longer the world of resistance. By 1946, priorities had shifted. Jewish leadership was increasingly focused on immigration, survival, and the looming conflict over Palestine. Violence was being rebranded as defense, not vengeance. Any action that threatened international legitimacy was seen as existentially dangerous. Kovner's request was radioactive. Even among those who sympathized deeply with survivor rage, the idea of poisoning cities crossed a line. It risked redefining Jews not as victims of genocide, but as perpetrators of mass civilian murder. The political consequences could be catastrophic. Sympathy, hard-won and fragile, could evaporate overnight. There was also fear. Not moral fear, but strategic fear. Fear that such an act would provoke reprisals against Jewish displaced persons still living in Europe. Fear that it would justify renewed violence. Fear that it would hand anti-Semites exactly the narrative they craved. Kovner encountered resistance, hesitation, and silence. And while these debates unfolded, something else happened. He was being watched. British authorities, responsible for security across large parts of Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, were acutely sensitive to instability. They monitored militant movements closely, particularly those involving underground networks and false documentation. Kovner's movements triggered suspicion. He was detained. The arrest did not come with public charges or dramatic confrontation. It was administrative, procedural, quiet. The kind of intervention states prefer when they want to stop something without explaining why. Kovner understood immediately what this meant. Plan A was finished. The poison never reached Europe. Whatever contacts had been established were cut off. Documents were destroyed. Messages were not sent. Nakam, waiting for confirmation, received instead silence. Inside the group, panic and disbelief spread. Some feared infiltration. Others assumed betrayal. Meetings became tense, fragmented. The certainty that had fueled the plan dissolved into paranoia. More than anything, they realized something profoundly unsettling. The same systems that had failed to stop genocide were remarkably efficient at stopping revenge. The Allies had struggled to prevent mass murder carried out openly for years. But when survivors attempted to reverse the moral flow, when violence threatened stability rather than order, intervention was swift. This realization cut deep. Plan A collapsed without a single drop of poison entering a water system. No cities were touched. No reckoning occurred. The world continued rebuilding, unaware of how close it had come to catastrophe of a different kind. For some members of Nakam, this failure felt like a relief they were ashamed to acknowledge. For others, it felt like humiliation. They had committed themselves mentally to an act of irreversible scale, only to be stopped before the point of no return. Yet the collapse of Plan A did not end Nakam's resolve. It transformed it. If the world would not tolerate mass vengeance against civilians, then the focus would shift. Not toward forgiveness, but toward targets that could not be morally defended by appeals to innocence. The logic was ruthless, but adaptive. Former SS personnel were being held in prisoner of war camps across Germany. Men who had worn the uniforms. Men who had enforced selections, guarded camps, escorted transports. Men whose guilt was not collective or abstract, but documented in ink and testimony. They were alive, they were fed. They were protected by international law. To Nakam, this protection felt like obscenity, layered upon obscenity. The failure of Plan A forced the group to confront a truth they had tried to avoid. That scale invited resistance, while precision might succeed. The world might tolerate quiet deaths. It would not tolerate catastrophe. And so the most radical idea Nakam ever conceived, poisoning entire cities, was abandoned not because it was immoral, but because it was impossible. History would never know how close it came. What remained was a narrower, darker path, one that did not seek to shake nations, but to pierce silence, one that aimed not at society as a whole, but at those who could not plausibly claim ignorance. Plan A had failed. Plan B was already taking shape. The new logic was narrower, colder, and in some ways more dangerous. If mass vengeance against civilians was impossible, then vengeance would be redirected toward those whose guilt could not be disputed. Not the abstract German people, but men with uniforms, ranks, and paper trails. Men whose presence in prisoner of war camps was itself an admission of responsibility. Across occupied Germany, tens of thousands of former SS members were being held in Allied-run camps. Some had been captured in the final days of the war. Others had surrendered voluntarily, calculating that captivity was safer than disappearance. They lived behind fences, under guard, fed and clothed by the victors. Many believed, correctly, that time was on their side. Investigations were slow. Evidence was incomplete. Witnesses were scattered or dead. As the months passed, the likelihood of severe punishment diminished. Some guards boasted openly that they would be home soon. For Nakam, these camps represented an unbearable inversion of justice. The men who had starved prisoners now received rations. The men who had beaten children slept under blankets. The men who had enforced annihilation waited patiently for due process. The shift in target did not soften Nakam's resolve. It sharpened it. They no longer sought a symbolic earthquake. They sought penetration. The goal was not to shock the world, but to reach the perpetrators where they felt safest, inside systems designed to protect them. The method emerged, almost naturally: bread. In the camps, food distribution was centralized. Bakeries produced thousands of identical loaves daily. The process relied on civilian labor, minimal oversight, and trust. Guards checked quantities, not chemistry. Bread passed through many hands, few of which asked questions. It was the perfect vector. Nakam members began gathering information quietly. Which bakeries supplied which camps? Which delivery routes were used? Who worked the night shifts? Where security was lax? They exploited the same weaknesses they had learned to exploit during the war: bureaucracy, fatigue, assumption. They moved carefully, using forged papers and borrowed identities. In a Europe still drowning in refugees and displaced persons, anonymity was easy. No one expected Jewish survivors to infiltrate supply chains feeding SS prisoners. The idea itself seemed unthinkable. That disbelief became their cover. The poison they used was applied directly to bread, destined for camps holding former SS personnel, particularly in the region around Nuremberg. The choice of location was deliberate. Nuremberg was not just a city. It was a symbol, the birthplace of Nazi rallies, the site of racial laws, and now, the location of trials that Nakam viewed as insufficient. If justice was being performed there, then vengeance would answer it there. The operation unfolded without drama, no alarms, no immediate detection. Loaves were delivered as usual. Prisoners ate as usual. Then people began to fall ill. At first, Allied authorities suspected food poisoning or disease. Post-war camps were vulnerable to outbreaks. Sanitation was inconsistent. Medical supplies were stretched thin. But the pattern escalated quickly. Hundreds of prisoners collapsed with violent symptoms: vomiting, convulsions, severe distress. Hospitals filled. Doctors were baffled. Panic spread among camp administrators. Guards feared sabotage. Investigations were launched. Bread deliveries were halted. Samples were tested. The truth emerged quietly, without headlines. Poison. How many died remains uncertain. Some accounts speak of dozens. Others suggest fewer. Official numbers were never released. Allied authorities had no incentive to publicize the incident. Acknowledging that SS prisoners had been poisoned under their watch raised uncomfortable questions about security, control, and vulnerability. So the incident was contained, managed, and buried. For Nakam, the outcome was deeply ambiguous. The poison had worked. Their plan had been executed. Former SS men had suffered and, in some cases, died. Yet the world did not stop. There were no public statements, no reckoning, no acknowledgement that vengeance had occurred at all. The silence was devastating. Some members felt vindicated. Others felt hollow. They had crossed a line quietly, efficiently, and history had barely noticed. The act they believed would carve memory into the post-war narrative instead dissolved into classified reports and sealed files. What disturbed them most was not condemnation, but indifference. Within the group, fractures widened. There were arguments about whether the operation had gone far enough, about whether secrecy had neutered its meaning, about whether the world's refusal to respond proved their original logic correct or fatally flawed. For some, Plan B marked the end of hope that revenge could achieve anything beyond momentary satisfaction. Killing a handful of perpetrators, even symbolically, did not force society to confront its complicity. It did not undo erasure. It did not resurrect the dead. For others, the problem was not the act, but its limitation. Had Plan A succeeded, they argued, history would not have been able to look away. These debates had no resolution. Meanwhile, pressure mounted from outside. Allied intelligence services increased scrutiny of survivor networks. Rumors circulated. Names were whispered. The risk of exposure grew. Jewish leaders, already struggling to navigate immigration crises and political negotiations, wanted nothing to do with clandestine revenge operations. They feared backlash. They feared delegitimization. They feared that violence directed backward would undermine the struggle ahead. And there was a struggle ahead. By 1947, the focus of Jewish political energy had shifted decisively toward the fight for a state. Survival was no longer only about memory. It was about territory, defense, and international recognition. Every action was weighed against its potential impact on that future. Nakam no longer fit. Its members were survivors of a war the world wanted to conclude, not architects of a future the world was beginning to negotiate. Their rage was understandable but inconvenient. Their actions were effective, but destabilizing. One by one, members drifted away. Some joined new military formations. Some emigrated. Some disappeared into ordinary life, carrying secrets they would rarely speak of again. There was no formal dissolution, no final meeting. Nakam faded, because the world around it moved on. Plan B became its last act. In retrospect, the operation revealed a brutal truth. Revenge, when stripped of spectacle, does not transform history. It satisfies something deeply human, but it does not rewrite narratives. It does not replace courts. It does not create consensus. It leaves behind only bodies and silence. This realization did not bring peace. It brought exhaustion. By the time the bread was buried and the files sealed, Nakam had reached the limits of what clandestine violence could achieve. The group had proven that survivors could strike back. What they could not prove was that striking back changed anything. The war they had lived through had taught them that violence was sometimes necessary. The aftermath taught them something colder, that violence alone was never enough. As Nakam receded into shadow, the question it had embodied remained unresolved. How does a society respond to a crime so vast that no punishment feels adequate? How does justice function when the scale of suffering overwhelms the tools designed to address it? The world chose one answer. Nakam had chosen another. The tension between those choices would define the decades to come. By the time the last poisoned loaves were removed from circulation and the files quietly sealed, Nakam had reached the edge of its own logic. Not a dramatic end. No arrests en masse, no final meeting. Just a slow realization that the space in which Nakam had been possible was closing. The world had changed again. In 1945 and 1946, Europe was a moral vacuum. Institutions were shattered, borders porous, authority provisional. Revenge could masquerade as justice because justice itself had not yet found its footing. By 1947, that vacuum was gone. New priorities hardened. Lines were drawn. The past was being reorganized into archives, court transcripts, and commemorations. Nakam did not fit into any of those categories. Pressure came from every direction. Allied authorities, embarrassed by the exposure of their own vulnerabilities after the poisoning of SS prisoners, tightened surveillance over displaced persons camps and underground networks. The tolerance that had existed for survivor self-organization evaporated. Intelligence services did not need to dismantle Nakam openly. They only needed to make continued clandestine action risky. At the same time, Jewish leadership, fragmented, overburdened, and focused on survival, grew increasingly hostile to any action that threatened legitimacy. The struggle for a state demanded international sympathy, not fear. It demanded moral clarity, not ambiguity. The very rage that had fueled Nakam now appeared as a liability. This was not a judgment on pain. It was a calculation. There was also a deeper fear, one that few articulated publicly, but many carried privately. That revenge would hand anti-Semites a new narrative. The world had barely begun to accept the scale of Jewish suffering. If survivors became associated with mass violence, even in retaliation, sympathy could flip into condemnation with frightening speed. Nakam understood this fear. They had lived inside narratives powerful enough to justify extermination. They knew how easily meaning could be twisted. Yet understanding did not bring agreement. Inside the group, exhaustion set in. Not physical exhaustion, moral exhaustion. The certainty that had driven Plan A and Plan B began to fracture under the weight of consequences that no longer felt transformative. Revenge had not forced remembrance. It had not reshaped the post-war order. It had produced suffering that disappeared into silence. What Nakam had confronted, without fully naming it, was a brutal truth. Violence without witnesses does not become history. It becomes rumor. As the political horizon shifted toward the conflict in Palestine, the logic of action inverted. Violence was no longer backward-facing, aimed at settling accounts. It was forward-facing, aimed at survival. Fighters were needed, discipline was needed, control was needed. The chaotic moral energy of revenge had no place in a project that required unity and restraint. Many former Nakam members crossed that threshold quietly. Some joined military formations preparing for the coming war. Others emigrated, married, built lives that had seemed impossible only years earlier. A few remained haunted, unable to reconcile what they had planned or done with the future now unfolding. There was no repudiation of Nakam, but there was no continuation either. The group dissolved because its reason for existence evaporated. The war it had been fighting, against forgetting, had changed form. And yet Nakam did not vanish entirely. It left behind a pressure that reshaped how justice would be pursued. Its failure forced a choice. If revenge could not stand in for accountability, then accountability had to become real. Delayed justice would have to be more than symbolic. This shift did not happen overnight. It emerged slowly, through persistence rather than spectacle, through archives, testimonies, investigations, through the painstaking work of identifying perpetrators who had built new lives under new names. The emphasis moved from consequence to record, from fear to exposure. The most visible symbol of this transformation came years later, when Israeli intelligence tracked down a man who embodied everything Nakam had despised. A bureaucrat of annihilation who had escaped judgment and lived freely for more than a decade. His capture did not involve poison or mass terror. It involved surveillance, patience, and a courtroom. The trial of Adolf Eichmann was not revenge. It was theater in the oldest sense, a public reckoning meant to be seen and remembered. Survivors testified. Documents were read aloud. The machinery of genocide was dismantled piece by piece in front of the world. This was not Nakam's justice, but it answered Nakam's accusation. The world listened. What changed was not only method, but philosophy. The pursuit of Nazi criminals became a process of naming rather than annihilating. The goal was not equivalence of suffering, but permanence of memory. A verdict could not resurrect the dead, but it could prevent erasure. Organizations like Mossad would later become associated with this pursuit, not as executioners, but as agents of exposure. Operations aimed to bring fugitives to court, not to graves. The message shifted decisively. Crimes would not be answered in kind. They would be documented beyond denial. In this sense, Nakam functioned as a warning flare. It revealed what happens when justice stalls long enough for despair to harden into strategy. It demonstrated the cost of silence, not only in lives, but in the moral pressure it places on survivors. The group's disappearance did not mean its questions were resolved. It meant they were reframed. Was Nakam wrong? Or was it a symptom of a failure that no court could fully repair? History tends to prefer clean answers. Nakam resists them. Its members were not villains in search of chaos, nor heroes in pursuit of purity. They were survivors navigating a landscape where every available option felt compromised. Law felt inadequate. Forgiveness felt obscene. Revenge felt necessary, and then insufficient. What remains of Nakam is not a blueprint for action, but a boundary marker. It shows where justice, when delayed or diluted, begins to resemble abandonment. It shows how quickly victims can be pushed toward extremes when institutions ask them to wait indefinitely. The legacy of Nakam lives not in the acts that were carried out, but in the acts that were ultimately rejected. In the decision, conscious or not, to abandon mass vengeance in favor of something slower, quieter, and more enduring. Judgment instead of retaliation. Exposure instead of terror. Memory instead of arithmetic. This choice did not erase pain. It did not redeem the past, but it prevented the future from being defined by an endless echo of violence. And perhaps that is the final, uncomfortable lesson. When justice does not arrive, people invent substitutes. Some of those substitutes are catastrophic. Others are merely tragic. Nakam stands at that crossroads, a reminder that the distance between victim and executioner is not always measured in morality, but in time. Too much time without justice, and the line begins to blur. The question that never closes history prefers endings. It wants trials to conclude, verdicts to be delivered, dates to be underlined in textbooks. It wants violence to stop meaning something once it stops happening. It wants the past to stay where it belongs. The story of Nakam refuses all of that, because Nakam was never really about what happened. It was about what didn't. It was born in the gap between crime and consequence, in the silence after liberation, when the world was already learning how to look forward while survivors were still counting the dead. It emerged not because people loved violence, but because they feared erasure more than condemnation. That is the uncomfortable truth at the core of the story. The members of Nakam were not asking to be understood. They were asking whether a world that allowed genocide had earned the right to demand restraint from its victims, whether morality could be invoked selectively, preached after the fact, enforced only when it preserved order. Their answer was extreme. So were the circumstances that shaped it. It is easy, decades later, to judge their choices from a distance made safe by institutions that now exist precisely because such choices were once imaginable. Courts, archives, memorials, laws that claim permanence, mechanisms that promise, however imperfectly, that crimes against humanity will not simply dissolve into time. But those mechanisms did not exist when Nakam was formed. Or rather, they existed only as promises. And promises are fragile when you have watched them fail before. The question Nakam forces us to confront is not whether revenge is justified. History has largely answered that. Revenge does not heal. It does not restore. It does not build a future anyone wants to live in. The harder question is this: what happens when justice arrives too late to prevent despair? Can we judge those who stood at that edge without acknowledging the conditions that pushed them there? Can we celebrate law without remembering how close its absence came to reshaping the world in far darker ways? Nakam did not become a movement. It did not leave monuments. It left a warning. That memory without accountability curdles into rage. That silence is not neutral. That asking victims to wait indefinitely is not a moral position. It is a gamble. In the end, the world chose courts over poison, testimony over terror. That choice mattered. It still does. But it was not inevitable. It was shaped, in part, by the knowledge that alternatives had been considered and narrowly abandoned. The story of Nakam is not an endorsement of violence. It is a reminder of its proximity, a reminder that justice delayed does not simply fade away. It transforms. And when it does, it can take forms far more dangerous than the crimes it seeks to answer. History did not repeat Nakam's logic, but it was forced to reckon with it. And that reckoning may be the quiet reason why some crimes are still hunted decades later, not out of vengeance but out of fear of what fills the void when justice fails. Because the most unsettling legacy of Nakam is not what they plan to do. It is how understandable their reasoning can seem when justice does not come.